these two people. One is the Rambam. Rabbi stands for Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Rabbi Moses, the son of Maimon. Maimon, by the way, is a Spanish name. It's not a Hebrew name, it's a Spanish name. His father, as you see, just to give some basic biography, but he was born 1135 in Cordoba, Spain, on the 14th of Nisan. It's unusual to know when someone's born. Usually, in our great people, we only know when they died. We don't know when they were born. Why is that? The reason is fairly obvious. When he was born, he wasn't Maimonides. He was a kid. Like, who knows? No one, history doesn't record the birthday of the kid. He's another kid. He's slobbering. He's crying. He's a kid. No one knows. Look at him and say, he's the Rambam. I mean, maybe his parents look at him and say, it's Maimonides, right? But no. So unusually enough, Maimonides' birth was recorded. So I don't know why that is, but it was, and it's 1135. Huh?
Because it was Passover.
Maybe because it was a special time. It was the eve of Passover, 14th of Nisan, so his mother probably was significant, because instead of being able to prepare for the Seder and finish the final things in cleaning and etc., she's giving birth, right? So she probably reminded about him the rest of her life. Remember that Pesach, you were born.
That's why his name is...
Right, it's like, and he doesn't get a birth...
That's why it was called Moshe.
Maybe. He doesn't get a birthday cake, nothing. Anyway, so he's born Erev Pesach, and his father Maimon was a judge, a dayan, in the Jewish community in Spain. Now, you should know, in Spain at the time was ruled by Muslims. They used to call it Al-Andalus, Andalusia, right? We would say in English, but it was ruled by Muslims. Now, not all, about 90% of the Jews lived under the Muslims, and that's why we pointed out last week that so many of the Jewish books are written in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic words, but in Hebrew script, because we lived under Muslim rule, and that was the language of the Jews, was one of the language, standard language we spoke was Arabic. So he's lived, but however, there were ups and downs amongst the Muslims. Living under the Muslims was actually, for much of history, was better than living under the Christians. As a rule, the Muslims treated the Jews as second-class citizens. That's a religious precept. It's called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. You are a dhimmi. That means it basically means a second-class citizen, right? So, however, we were tolerated. We had freedom of religion. They did not attempt to convert us. They did not force us to convert. There were crusades, inquisitions, pogroms. They were few and far between. We didn't have that much in the Muslim world. However, that changed a little bit. Maimonides was 16, approximately. Cordoba was captured by a group of Muslims called the Almohads. Now, the Almohads were much more hardcore than the previous Muslims who ruled Spain, and they said only Muslims may live in Spain. You want to live in Spain? You've got to convert. Of course, the Christians didn't invent the Inquisition. This was actually, the Almohads did this in Spain. Later on, the Christians came and declared Queen Isabella, who, by the way, the church made a saint, right? She declared that anyone who, because she supervised the torture and death of thousands of Jews. I don't know why is that sainthood, whatever. So, but basically, she said only Christians in Spain. And later on only in Portugal, later on it moved to Brazil, and of course the Jews first came to the North America from escaping the Inquisition from Brazil, and they came to the South Carolina area. That's where the earliest Jews came to America, escaping the Inquisition in Brazil, which followed them from Europe. Anyway, so the Almohads invade Spain, and life changes radically. Until that time, Maimonides, Rambam, had been taught by his father. His father was someone who believed, as did many, many Jews, most Jews of Spain, that the person's education should be broad and should be very intense. And he was tutored by his father. His father was a great Torah scholar, and he taught him Torah, but he also taught him mathematics, science, chemistry, biology, to the best of his knowledge at that time. And he had a very, very broad and intense education, primarily under his father. Together with his brother David, who he was very close with, they were homeschooled. And now until the age of 16, at the age of 16, they had the choice of conversion or death. And so what they did is they went into hiding in Spain. And his family, Maimonides, his brothers, his father, they wandered in Spain for a number of years, living in hiding. Living in hiding. They lived in caves, they lived in fields, they wandered around so they would not have to convert to Islam. Eventually, they made their way to Morocco. They moved to Morocco. Unfortunately, Morocco had a more liberal Islamic regime. And then in Morocco, the Almohads followed. So there was a religious revival in Morocco, and again, they were persecuted in Morocco. And according to some reports, they lived on the surface as Muslims, and underneath as Jews. In other words, very much like the conversos in Spain, people call them Marranos, but who basically lived on the surface as Christians. Now, it is less problematic to live as a Muslim, halachic, from the point of view of Jewish law. Maimonides discusses this extensively. Maimonides wrote, one of his most famous letters was a letter to the Jews of Yemen. The Jews of Yemen suffered a terrible, terrible persecution by the Muslims, and there were all types of issues. Should they die rather than convert to Islam? Should they die rather than enter a mosque? What should they do? There are many rabbis who said they should die rather than transgress. Maimonides disagreed with that. He said, if you are talking about something which is not pure monotheism, like Christianity, who believes in the incarnation, as Bishop Athanasius calls it, the incarnatia, the idea that God came into a human body, that's idolatry. Jew must die rather than acknowledge that. If you believe in the Trinity, it's idolatry. That's a tainted monotheism. Jew must die rather than agree to that. But Islam is mistaken. Muhammad was not a prophet. He did not fly overnight to Jerusalem on a horse. Right? It is not true. However, it's not idolatry. Muslims believe in one God. They pure, unadulterated monotheism. Entering into a mosque is not a prohibition. How do I know? I've davened in a mosque before. Anyone? I'm sure some of you may have. Anyone prayed in a mosque before? Come on, admit it, admit it.
The Western Wall.
Not the Western Wall, it's not a mosque. In Hebron, if you've been to the grave, the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Leah, right? They're buried in Hebron, and the Muslims, right, they converted that whole area into a mosque. We pray in there, right? Because a mosque is not idolatrous. So therefore, when Maimonides wrote this, a tremendously encouraging letter to the Yemenite Jews, he actually, from the time of that letter, the Yemenite Jews became absolute, complete devotees of Maimonides. They ignored every other halachic legal authority except for Maimonides to this very day. There are Yemenite Jews who will not look at the code of Jewish law. They'll just Maimonides. That's it, and that's legitimate. That's okay, right? And they became, because he saved their lives literally, because he told them you don't have to die rather than he saved their lives literally. He saved their lives psychologically, because people who had converted to Islam under the threat in Yemen, there were members of the Jewish community who did not want to accept them back. Maimonides said, oh no. He says, you accept them back, because once you're a Jew, you're always a Jew. Even if a person transgressed terrible stuff, they are still Jewish. Even if a person became an apostate deliberately, and they want to return, they're still Jewish. And he says, how much more so? These people did it out of fear. These people only did it openly. These people secretly still believed in Judaism, and you want to reject them? And he also gives encouragement to the Yemenite Jews. He says all of these type of trials and tribulations were predicted by the Torah. We were told that we'd be persecuted by the sword and the tongue. Meaning, the sword meaning by violence, and the tongue means by attempts to missionize, to convert us. He says, right, or to condemn us in the United Nations. Right? Either way, we're persecuted by both. He says, these have been predicted. We'll outlive them. Do not worry. Right? And his beautiful, beautiful letter to the Jews of Yemen really was so full of love and wisdom and clarity and hope that it literally saved the Jews of Yemen in many ways. But Maimonides, when he wrote this letter much later in his life, when he was much older, he was not writing without experience here. It wasn't just a matter of his knowing the law. He lived through this. He lived through the persecution of the Almohads in Spain. Can you imagine you're a 16-year-old kid, 16, everything's going normal, you have a nice house, you study, right, you've got you play with your brother, and then suddenly the regime says, you have got to change your religion. You've got to throw out your tefillin, you've got to stop doing, that's it. right? I mean, I'm sure we can relate. This happened to Jews many times in history. Everything seems to be going okay, and then boom, Kristallnacht, right? Boom, right? Expulsion from Spain, expulsion from England, expulsion from etc., etc. This was the type of thing that unfortunately Jews have experienced. Interesting, I'm just reading the book The Prime Ministers. Anyone read that? It's a phenomenal book. It's a book about the Israeli written by one of the advisors, an advisor to, I think, 5 prime ministers of Israel. Right, from both Labour and Likud, etc., and a religious Jew. Fascinating book. It's called The Prime Ministers. It's one of the best books I've ever read about Israeli history. Unbelievable, insider's look. So he writes about Menachem Begin. When he became prime minister, he had a Bible study group in the office every one night of the week. Ben Gurion did this. It was stopped by other prime ministers, but Menachem Begin reinstated it. And it describes how he's sitting there with a group of scholars. There's one rabbi. There's Nechama Leibovitz. She was a professor at Hebrew University, one of the most brilliant Bible scholars of our time. There was a secular Israeli archaeologist. There was this incredibly interesting, diverse group. And they're studying the verse, Am levadad yishkon ubagoyim lo yitchashav. We are described in the Torah as a nation that dwells alone and not counted amongst the nations. And Menachem Begin was saying, is this not a fact? Right? We are the only nation in the world who cannot sit in the UN Security Council because we're not a member of any regional group. Asia doesn't want us. The Arabs don't want us. So we don't. It's like we're not in a group. Where are we? You ask, what regional group is Israel in? You ask the United, what regional group is Israel in? They'll say, we aren't. Israel's not in a regional group. Where is Israel? On Mars? But what, was no region? It's not in Asia, it's not in the Middle East. It's not in the Middle East because the Arabs, who we're supposed to negotiate with, refuse to acknowledge our existence in the region. Forget our existence with these borders. Forget anything else. We don't even exist in the region. It's not even in the maps. It's like unbelievable. So that's what I'm talking about. Everyone gave a different explanation. It's fascinating. So we've experienced this before. Maimonides went through it. So they're in Morocco. And in Morocco, Maimonides, they lived there for a number of years. And then they decided to move to Israel in 1165. On the way to Israel, Maimonides, beautiful letter, Maimonides describes that, by the way, in the Cairo Gniza that we discussed last week, a number of letters, this is where a number of the letters that I'm quoting from were actually found in the Cairo Gniza that we talked about, right? So, in one letter, Maimonides describes how they're on the way to Israel and there was a terrible storm. And they thought the ship was going to sink. He says during this time he goes down into the hold and he is alone in his room, praying and meditating in his room. And he writes, they were eventually saved from this storm. They made it to Israel. And he writes in the letter, he says, from that time on, I declared that day that we were in the midst of that storm, as I was alone, just God and myself, in the midst of the storm. So from that day on, for the rest of my life, that anniversary, I will be alone in my room with myself and God, praying and meditating, fasting for that day. That's how he commemorated that. Right? He felt it was appropriate that it was just him and God together, and that was it, and he survived, God saved him, and he continued. He lands in Akko, in the port of Acre, right? You've heard of Saint-Jean d'Acre, right? Joan of Arc. Right, that's Acre. It's a city in the north of Israel, just north of Haifa. And it was a famous port. And he lands in Acre, and he declares on the day he lands in Israel, because we take Israel for granted. Some of us. I don't know if everyone does. Right? I don't see anyone here old enough to remember the foundation of the State of Israel. Right, 1948. But for those of us who've grown up with Israel, we take it for granted. Take it for granted. You know, you go to Israel, oh my gosh, the flight was terrible, it was crowded, no one listens on El Al, who listens to the stewardess? No one listens, right? You can tell if there's a lot of Christian pilgrims on the flight. Because if there's Christian pilgrims, you can tell, when it lands, if everyone stays seated, it's basically a Christian pilgrims on the flight. Right? If as soon as it touches down, everyone gets up, while the plane's still like, you know, right? It's all Jews. Right? So we take it for granted. When Maimonides' boat landed in Akko, he declared that day a Yom Tov, a festival in his family. He made that day into a festival for all time. The day that he first merited to set foot in the holy land of Israel, he declared it a festive day, and his family, they would wear their Yontov, their Shabbat clothing, they'd have a special meal, they'd light candles, they'd say special psalms. Because he merited to come to the land of Israel. Beautiful thing. Then he gets from Akko, someone takes them, he and his family, he takes them to Jerusalem. I think they went to Yerushalayim first. In Jerusalem, when he gets to the Western Wall, he declares another festival in his life that he will celebrate for the rest of his life in his family, the day that he first merited coming to Jerusalem. That's a festival. And then he is taken to Hebron, to the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, and he declares another Yontif. So from the one trip to Israel, Maimonides' family has one fast day and 3 Yontifs. Right? You think of it, what are the events that mark our lives? Right? I don't know, I remember when my baseball team won, who cared? You know what I mean? The irrelevant stuff. Here, the day he merited the land of Israel, the day he merited to go to Jerusalem and to pray there, as he describes it, at the gate of heaven, and the day that he merited to pray at the tomb of our patriarchs and matriarchs, and the day that he went to the land in Israel, all these are festivals preserved in his family for generations. Anyway, he had to leave Israel. He did not have rest in Israel either. There was apparently some plot to kidnap him. It's unclear what the danger was, but apparently it was from the Crusaders, and he had to leave Israel. Now, at the time, there was a very large Jewish community in a place called Fostat. Fostat is what we call Old Cairo. Old Cairo, Fostat. And Fostat was where a lot of Jews lived in Fostat, in Egypt. So he moved to Fostat, Old Cairo, in Egypt. Now, for many years, that's where he really became very productive. He wrote books already before this time, but he became most productive in Fostat, in Old Cairo. And he was supported by his brother David, who we discussed last week. His brother David was a merchant, used to deal primarily in precious stones. He went as far as India in some of his trips, and he supported Maimonides, while Maimonides was able to learn and to write his books. Eventually, Maimonides' brother David died in a shipwreck in India. As we saw last week, we have in the Cairo Gniza was found the last letter that Maimonides' brother David sent to Maimonides. So we have this very beautiful letter. We read it. Those who remember, I see a lot of familiar faces here, right? So we read that letter last week. Very beautiful. And at that point, Maimonides had to become a doctor. He said, how could he become a doctor? I mean, can you imagine, like, let's say, God forbid, you're an accountant, or something like that, you lose your job, you say, fine, I'll become a doctor tomorrow. How do you do that? So the answer is he already had tremendous amount of knowledge. His father taught him a tremendous amount of physiology. He taught him anatomy. He had studied all these things. Right? And aside from his independent study, and he'd read, we see from his writings, he'd read all the works of the great and famous Greek doctors, right? Hippocrates, Galen, etc., etc. So he was well versed in the medicine of his time. He was well versed in science, and he was a very quick learner as well, and so he became a physician. And why did he become a physician? Because he maintained that you're not allowed to make a living from Torah. He said he knew he could become the rabbi of Cairo instantly. He'd get a nice salary, become the rabbi. Right? He didn't want to do that. There's actually a story, there's just a contemporary story. There was a Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer. He was a student. He was in the 19th century, a student of someone named Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, who was the founder of what's called the Musar movement, which was to teach ethics. So Yitzhak Blazer was a brilliant Torah scholar, but he had a house painting company. That's what he used to paint houses. Yitzhak Blazer, for the first few years after he finished yeshiva, left yeshiva, he painted houses. He didn't want to make a living from Torah. Painted houses. Later on, his teacher forced him to become chief rabbi of St. Petersburg. He was chief rabbi of St. Petersburg for 16 years. And it really was, he hated every moment of it. There was all the politics with the Tsarist government, the Orthodox Church in Russia. It was terrible. It was a terrible, soul-destroying post. Eventually, when he left, post as chief rabbi, he'd actually accumulated a lot of money because they didn't have children during that time. He and his wife decided they're going to move back to Kovno, where he can study Torah, and they opened a boarding house and restaurant. And they used to have a small study hall where he'd sit and study Torah, and when his wife felt that it was getting too busy, she'd ring a bell and he'd come in and serve. So he was the former chief rabbi of the capital city of Russia. One of the greatest students of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, Rabbi Yitzhak Blazer. You would be sitting in the restaurant in Kovno, and Rabbi Blazer would come along with a, "Did you order soup, sir?" Because he wanted to work. He wanted to work from his own sweat, his own hands. Is that unbelievable? And so he's sitting there. He's serving a table of important rabbis. He brought them soup. And one of the rabbis says, a little bit condescendingly, sneeringly, he says, "So this is better than being chief rabbi of St. Petersburg?" And Rabbi Blazer said, "Absolutely." He said, "When I was chief rabbi, I didn't have a moment's peace of mind to think in depth about the Talmud, Rashi, Tosfot. I was continuously caught up with politics and this and that." He says, "Now," he says, "I sit and study." He says, "My wife rings the bell, I come out and serve." He says, "While I'm serving soup, what do you think I'm thinking about? The soup?" He says, "I'm thinking about the Talmud." He says, "I have total peace of mind. I don't have to worry about anything. This is fantastic." So that's what Maimonides did not want to do. He wanted to also. So he decided he's going to make a living from being a physician. He became a physician. His fame spread so quickly, he became the official physician of the court of the ruler of Egypt at the time. The ruler of Egypt was a fellow by the name of Salah al-Din, who was Maimonides' patient. Maimonides functioned as his personal physician. He was the physician for the entire court, which included the harem, which included all the ministers, and the family of Saladin. And as a physician then, they didn't have specialties then. You didn't have psychiatry, right, and dentistry, and you're a doctor, you take care of everything, you're a doctor, right? You don't care, you specialise?
Yes.
What's your specialty? Anesthesia. So obviously you don't have people telling you their problems. If they do, that's a real problem. You're not. Listen, oh, he's awake, right? Obviously, right. So when you're a physician back then, right? There's actually, I have a relative who's an anesthesiologist. He told the rabbi in the synagogue. He says, we have a very similar job. He says, right? He says, but you do much better than I. Rabbi says, what do you mean? He says, I only put one person to sleep at a time. Your sermons, 100 people. So yes, it was me. But okay, right. Anyway, so Maimonides also functioned as like the psychologist of Saladin. You know what I mean? He would help him deal with his emotional issues, his mental problems, etc. He had his children. He had a son who was obviously, his son had some type of sexually transmitted disease. Maimonides helped him out. He counselled him. He wrote a whole treatise on safe practices. Right? He wrote a whole treatise on this type of stuff, on sexuality, etc., for the benefit of Saladin, who also had a harem, by the way. So, right? So anyway, he wrote a tremendous amount of stuff about this, and he was a very popular doctor. Maimonides writes, there's a fascinating insight into what his day was like. There's a letter he writes to, now, as I mentioned, most of his work's written in Arabic. Now, how do they get translated into Hebrew? So there was a family from France called the Ibn Tibbon family. Ibn Tibbon family were famous translators, like a family of translators. You know, like the Rothschilds are in banking, right? So this is the Ibn Tibbons were the translators. So one of them translated Maimonides' works from Arabic to Hebrew. Maimonides, and he writes to Maimonides, I'd like to come and see you. Here he is in France. Maimonides is in Cairo, Fostat. He says, I want to come to see you. And Maimonides says, I love you like my own son. He says, your translations are what you have the passion for the work. You understand the idea that translation cannot be literal. He says, you've got to be focused on what the idea is, right? You've got to be focused on the idea, right, rather than the literal. I mean, translation is always a problem. There's an Italian proverb. I'm sure you may be familiar with it. Italian proverb. Reading poetry in translation is like kissing the bride through the veil. Right, so I don't know the original Italian, but basically, right, so translation is always a problem, right? So Maimonides already said, Tibbon, you are a good translator. You know what you're doing, right? You know what you're doing. So he says, and I love you like a son, but he says, for you to come to see me, for you to make the trip from France to Cairo, braving pirates, right, Christians, Muslims, slave traders, you name it, to come to me, he says, I may be able to spend 5 minutes with you. Maybe. He says, let me describe my day. So in the letter he describes it, we have the letter from the Cairo, right? He says, I start a little before dawn, I wake up, I study, I pray. He says, immediately after grabbing something to eat, I then go, travel it's over an hour to the court of the vizier of Saladin. He says, I there deal with the people in the court, with the Saladin and everything else there for approximately until the afternoon. He says, I am able to come home just before sundown so I can pray afternoon service. He says, by the time I get into my house and grab something to eat, there's already, outside my surgery, there's a line of people waiting. Jews and non-Jews, sick, healthy, everyone, the whole long line waiting outside my surgery. He says, I then go and apologise to each person and try and do some triage. Who needs, who needs most, right? You've got to do a triage, right? Some guy standing there, right? Someone else got a sniffle. We're going to put them up, right? So he does that. He says, I start seeing patients. He says, by late in the evening, he says, I'm seeing the patients. I'm lying on the bed. The patients are standing up. He says, I don't have the strength to stand anymore. So imagine you walk in, the doctor's lying on the bed. Come over here. Right, let me take your pulse. Can you imagine that? Right, that's what it was like. Maimonides is lying on the couch. The patients are standing up because he doesn't have strength to stand up anymore. He says he does this until close to midnight is when he sees his patients.
Reverse psychology.
They feel better already. They see him, they feel better. Right, that's a good point. Right, so he does this until about midnight. He says then. He says he drags himself out of the surgery and he tries to study a bit of Torah. He says when it comes to Shabbat, he says Shabbat, he studies Torah, but he says on Shabbat, Jews from all over the place come to consult with me on halacha, Jewish law, communal activities, etc., etc. So he says I spend the entire Shabbat, meals, prayer, answering questions, communal questions, etc., etc. He says, so you'll schlep, he didn't say schlep, but whatever the equivalent is in Arabic, right? So he says, you'll schlep all the way from France to Cairo. He says, I may be able to squeeze you in for an appointment, right, maybe midnight for 5 minutes. Is it worth it? But you have an idea, that's what his life was like. That's what his life was like. And by the way, I should point out, even though he wasn't the official rabbi of Cairo, he was the rabbi of Cairo. So all the Jews asked him their questions, and he was involved in tremendous amounts of polemics with a particular group of Jews called the Karaites. We discussed them a little bit last week. The Karaites were Jews who had rejected the oral tradition. So the Karaites were obviously in opposition to Maimonides. As divine providence would have it, by the way, there was a similar controversy within Islam. There were Muslims who believed only in the Quran, but there's also, as you probably know, there's an oral tradition of the Quran known as the Hadith. Right? The Hadith. So there are those Muslims who rejected the Hadith, and there were those who accepted it. It so happened that his patient, Salah al-Din, was a follower of the Hadith. So that means Maimonides, he could sympathize with Maimonides' fight against the Karaites, who didn't accept the oral law, right? And Maimonides could sympathize with Saladin's fight against the anti-Hadith Muslims. Right, so they got along very well in many ways. Right, it is rumoured that one of the first things when Saladin conquered Jerusalem from the Crusaders, one of the first things he did was he let the Jews back in Jerusalem because the Christians forbade us from entering Jerusalem. They said because we rejected Jesus, we are condemned never to be in Jerusalem again, as Augustine and St. John Chrysostom and others said, and therefore we are destined to be on the outside carrying the books for those who belong inside, i.e. the Christians, followers of Jesus. So they threw us out of Jerusalem. Those Jews who were in Jerusalem, they killed, and they didn't allow any Jews to come into Jerusalem. The Muslims, under Salah al-Din, I don't know if this was in the movie, but nevertheless, in the book it is there. He led us into Jerusalem. Could be that was on the advice of his physician. Okay. So anyway, Maimonides was involved in tremendous polemics with the Karaites. The Karaites, and here's a fascinating one. This is a crossover. This is where his job as a doctor and his job as a rabbi and his argument with the Karaites crossed, right? Because you see, the Karaites believed, if you look at the Torah, right, it doesn't actually, it's not explicit in the Torah. The Torah says if you injure someone, what do you have to do?
An eye for an eye.
No. Well, no, that's only accident. It says you have to compensate. Well, that's true, compensation. But it says explicitly what type of compensation. You have to pay their unemployment. And also what it says is, I'll give you a hint because I'm in a good mood, Exodus 22. Okay? No, it's a giveaway. Right? What it says there is, V'rapot yirapeh. You shall heal him, you shall heal him. That means you've got to pay for his medical care. So what do you see from that? Is medical care allowed?
Yes.
Of course it is. Clearly. The Karaites believed you're not allowed to go to a doctor. The Karaites said it's going against God's decree to go to a doctor. The Karaites, and by the way, there are groups of people to this day who still believe that. There are certain groups, who is it?
Science.
The Christian Scientists, right? They're against that, right? There's a certain trend, certain religions. No, they say, God has smitten. Who are you to heal? Right? You cannot do that. Maimonides argues against it tremendously. So one of the things he found was that the community in Cairo were very negligent about hygiene and health and etc. And he was because of the influence of the Karaites. So as a rabbi, he felt it was a religious obligation. Cleanliness, hygiene, health. Right? As a Jew who believes in the oral tradition, he said it's an obligation to involve yourself in effort in this world. And of course, as a physician, he felt people are dying. His daughter actually died as a result of a plague, which is believed to be a result of these unhygienic conditions. And so he made it his business to clean up the place, which he did. Right? He made it his business to get rid of the Karaites, which he did. He argued them almost out of existence. Right? In other words, he was involved in polemics with them, and he managed to decrease the Karaite influence in Cairo to almost negligible. Sorry. So that was Maimonides with the Karaites and in Cairo. But interestingly enough, even though he maintained a major opposition to the Karaites, however, he writes, he says, however, a child of the Karaites, someone who's been brought up in their ways. He says you can't blame such a person. Such a person is like a child who was taken captive by idolaters and raised as an Jewish child taken captive by gypsies. He's raised in the, I guess they're Catholics, Romano Church. Roma Church, right? I'm sure the religion is probably closest to Catholicism, I'm guessing, right? I don't know any gypsies whatsoever. Never met a gypsy in my entire life. Anyway, they're not big in Australia, right? So or Israel for that matter. So, but anyway, if he's raised, so this guy finds out he's Jewish. He comes there, he finds out he's Jewish. What do? Right? Maimonides says we bring him close. We don't treat him as a opponent. We don't treat him as distant. We bring him close with cables of love, right? Because this person, and this is one of the central ideas, Maimonides, he writes about this extensively, as I said, to the Jews of Yemen. He finds out he's Jewish. I'll just tell you just a slightly off topic, but similar. There was the Aliyah Shaliach, this is the Israeli government representative in Melbourne, Australia, who helps people make Aliyah, go to Israel. This classic Australian Gentile walks into his office, and he says, "G'day, mate, I want to make Aliyah." And the Aliyah says, he says, "Are you Jewish, sir?" He says "I'm a Schneerson." Now, do you know Schneerson is the family name of? The Lubavitcher Rebbe. So the Aliyah is like blown away. This guy is a policeman from a place called Mildura. Mildura is a few hours north of Melbourne, a few hours south-west of Sydney. There may be one or two Jews in Mildura. I mean, there's nothing there. There's no shul in Mildura. It's nothing. What's a Schneerson? What is he doing in Mildura? So it turns out, you probably know, one of the Lubavitcher Rebbes, right, three ago, sent many of his students and family to settle in Israel in Hebron and in other places in Israel. He sent them to Israel. So what happens is that one of his grandchildren got involved in the Jewish underground against the British. So he's involved in the Irgun, right, who were fighting the British. People are familiar with this a little bit. He was fighting the British during the British Mandate, right? Anyway, he gets thrown in prison by the British. His daughter visits him in prison, brings him kosher food, etc. There's a prison guard, a British prison guard, very friendly, very nice guy, one of the few decent Englishmen that exists, right? Maybe one or two others, I don't know, right? So he's like, she meets him. What happens is she falls in love with the English soldier, a goy, right? He's not Jewish. Her father is in prison fighting for the Jewish underground in Israel, right? She is bringing food to her father and visiting her father in prison. She falls in love with a British soldier. They figure, look, getting married in Israel is probably not going to be ideal. You know what I mean? Right? He's British. Her father is in this underground organisation fighting the British. He's a British soldier. This is not going to work. To go to England, equally as bad. English hated, especially the Jews of Palestine. They hated us, right? So they decided to go. They will go as far away as humanly possible. Where'd they go? Australia. Now, not to Melbourne, because there's Jews in Melbourne, right? There's not to Sydney, there's Jews in Sydney. Where'd they go? Mildura. Gurnished. Nothing. She changes it. She's married to this British non-Jew. They change their name. Anyway, she never tells her child that they're Jewish. Because the kid's Jewish, mother's Jewish, he's Jewish. Right? So when she's dying, she's 90-something, she calls the son over and she says, "Come here." Right? I don't know if she said, "Come here." She said, "Come on." He says, "What? What the heck?" Right? And she says, "I want to tell you something." She says, "We're Jewish." Can you imagine this? An Australian policeman in Mildura, complete 100%, what we call 100% non-Jew. Right? And she says, not only is he Jewish, but he's a schneerson. You heard of the Lubavitcher Rabbi? He says, no. She said, we're descendants. Okay. So he starts reading about Judaism. He decides to get into it. He makes Aliyah. Unbelievable. He moved to Israel. I don't know what happened to him, but he moved to Israel. So Maimonides would say, Maimonides' view is 100% Jewish. 100% Jewish. Okay. So anyway, he also, during this time, he was also involved heavily in not only the community, but well before the internet, the Jewish people were connected globally. We did not need the internet to be connected globally. Maimonides was getting questions from France, from Spain, from Jews in Germany. He's getting questions from North Africa, from Tunisia, from Morocco, from Sudan, from Yemen, from Saudi Arabia, etc. He's communicating. His books get distributed all over the world. They're handwritten. Everything's handwritten. There's no printing machines. Right? His books end up in India, in the Jewish community in India. His books end up in Yemen, amongst Jews in Yemen. I mean, can you imagine this? It takes weeks to get anywhere. It takes weeks to get anywhere. And yet all the stuff spreads all over the world. So an amazing thing. Anyway, he died in 1204, and he was eventually buried in Tiberias in the north of Israel. His son, Avraham, took over and was himself a scholar in his own right. His son Avraham, his son Avraham had a son David, right, named obviously after their deceased uncle. And David moved to Aleppo in Syria. So the Maimon family moved to Aleppo in Syria and remained there until approximately the 1950s. Right? Now, they also brought with them a fascinating book called the Aleppo Codex, Keter Aram Soba, to put it in a technical term, which was a book written in Tiberias. It was actually a complete copy of the Bible, written by some rabbis in Tiberias, actually a family called the Ben Asher family. The Ben Asher family, right, wrote the most accurate version of the Torah, prophets, and writings, with all the with all every different reading and every vowel and every musical note, and they put so much care into it. This ended up in Jerusalem, in the care of a Karaite family. It was, many Jews were allowed to see it. Eventually it was sold by the Karaites to a family in Cairo. It ended up in Fostat. Maimonides saw it. And he writes about this codex in one of his letters, in his book Mishneh Torah. He writes that this is the most accurate Bible I've ever seen. You can rely upon this in every area. So his family took it to Aleppo, Syria with them. David Maimon went to Aleppo, Syria, took it with him. It remained, the Aleppo Codex remained, and it was seen, people took notes on it. There were, later on, people took pictures of it, like in 1800s, 1900s, right? And eventually it was there until 1948. 1948, the Aleppo Codex, which, by the way, was written in 8th century, when the State of Israel was created, the Syrian government encouraged the population to riot against the Jews and to burn down as many synagogues as possible. So the Syrians burnt down the Aleppo synagogue. The Codex, the Aleppo Bible, the first quarter or last quarter or so were burnt. But a Jew, the Gabbai, the sexton of the synagogue, bravely went in and saved it from the fire. And so he hid it in his house. And he smuggled it out of Syria to the United States in the 1950s. From the United States it was brought to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and so now we have most of the Aleppo Codex. The other parts of it, there was a Jew in Vilna, a scribe in Vilna, who made Aliyah in the 1800s, because he wanted, and one of the things, his aspiration was to see the Aleppo Codex. He got to Jerusalem, he got sick, he couldn't travel. He sent his son-in-law to Aleppo. His son-in-law took his father-in-law's Bible, and he wrote notes in the columns of everything he saw from the Aleppo Codex. And unfortunately, and he brought his Bible back to Jerusalem, and it got lost. Until 85. 1985, the family had a house in Kiryat Moshe, it's a neighbourhood in Jerusalem. The house was going to get demolished to make an apartment building. And they're cleaning out the house, and they find a collection of old books in the boydom. You know, Israeli apartments, they have these things under the ceiling called a boydom, which is where you put your Pesach stuff, right, etc. Anyway, or a kid if they're naughty. Whatever, it's like this area under the ceiling. It's like the Israeli equivalent of an attic, right? And they found in the boydom, guess what they found there? The Bible that was brought to Aleppo. So now we have the complete Aleppo Codex content, and the Hebrew University published it in a book called Keter Yerushalayim, which was seen by Maimonides in the 12th century. Now that is a little bit of a biographical sketch of Maimonides. Let's look at some of his works. I don't think we're going to get to the Maharal, is it? We may, but we'll see. False advertising, I'm sorry. Maybe next week we'll get to Maharal. I'll combine it with Prague. We'll see. So he wrote his first book, he wrote in 1158. How old was he in 1158? He was born in 1135. So he's 23 years old, right? He's 23 years old. He writes his first book, which is a book on astronomy, halacha, and mathematics combined, because it's all about the Jewish calendar. And you can see the greatness of Maimonides, because here it's a combination of Jewish law, combined, of course, with astronomy, because you've got to know astronomy to know the calendar, and also mathematics. Then he wrote explanation of logical terms. He wrote, one of his greatest works was Siraj, a commentary on the Mishnah. The commentary on the Mishnah, we saw an original copy of his handwriting of that last week, and his commentary on the Mishnah called the Siraj, which is Arabic for the light, or the shining, Jack Nicholson type thing, right? The shining. So in the Siraj, he actually, what he wanted to do was, he wanted to make the Mishnah accessible to everyone. Although in other words, he writes in one place that he'd prefer to write the truth and have 1,000 idiots not understand it, but have the few intellectuals understand it and grow, rather than obscure it and water it down. That's on the one hand. That's in the Guide for Perplexed. However, on the other hand, he wanted to make Torah accessible to everyone, without watering it down. He wanted to make it accessible. And this Mishnah, this commentary on the Mishnah, again, written in Arabic, so you're a Jew living back then in Tunisia, Morocco, Egypt, right? Mishnah is not easy. It's very concise. There's a lot of explanations. So you pick this up, and here it is. It's art scroll, right? It's in the language you speak. There's diagrams. Everything is made. And a beautiful thing he does, Maimonides writes, he says anytime he comes across some philosophical subject, some aspect of Jewish belief, of faith, he digresses and he goes at great length. He says, because nothing is dearer to me than teaching people about belief in God, in Judaism, and teaching the fundamentals of our faith. He says, so therefore, even though this is not the place to talk about it, I'm going to talk about it anyway. And indeed, in one of his greatest digressions, which we owe him a lot for, he wrote the 13 Principles of Faith. The very famous 13 Principles of Faith, which a lot of Jews recite every day after prayers. There's a beautiful poem. Anyone know the poem Yigdal? Yigdal Elokim Chai, right? That's a poem which is actually a poetic version of Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith. Next time you look at the Siddur, look at Yigdal, usually at the beginning of the Siddur, and look at the end of morning prayers, weekday morning prayers, you'll see the 13 Principles of Faith. Compare the two, you'll see that I believe with perfect faith that, and you look at Yigdal, you'll see it's a complete parallel. It's a 13-verse poem expressing these. So we say it before prayers and after prayers, very beautifully. Many Jews died with the words of Maimonides' principle on their mouths. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'viyas HaMashiach. There's a famous song, Jews sung it during the Holocaust, Jews sung it many, many times. So it's a very famous song, the 13 Principles of Faith. Also, in another fantastic digression, he writes an introduction to Ethics of the Fathers with his psychological theories. He talks about the soul, he talks about the need of the soul, he talks about psychological need. He says if a person feels they're getting a little depressed, he said what you need to do, he says, is go to a beautiful area, listen to good music, hang out with friends, look at beautiful things, eat good food, and spend a lot. He says, this will help you. Right, this will help you. Right, so again, he talks also about the nature of the soul, the idea that the one thing remaining ultimately in the human being is the intellect. the dart of the human being, which he seems to equate with the idea of the soul. He has a different understanding of soul than the Kabbalists, right? And he talks about the importance of intellect. These 13 principles of faith, the way he understands it is that they are the minimum things you need to know in order to have a normal relationship with God. For instance, to have a relationship with someone, I need to know certain things about them, and I need to deny certain things about them. Does that make sense? Example: if I believe, someone says, whatever, they set you up on a date, blind date, right? And the person they set you up with, you look at them and they say, I think this person is an alien, masquerading as a human being. They go home, they're going to pull off this mask, and underneath this hideous reptile. If you believe that about the other person, can you have a normal relationship?
No.
I think it'd be very difficult. You need a lot of therapy, right? I mean, it's a lot of therapy, right? So you can't, right? If you believe that the person you're speaking with has got multiple personality disorder, right? They've got 16 personalities, Sybil, 16 personalities. Can you have a normal relationship with them? Of course not.
Depends which personality.
Yeah, that's true. Right. I guess with one of the person, but it's very hard, right? You can't have a normal relationship. So Maimonides says, you want to have a relationship with God, you've got to know certain things about Him. Okay? You've got to know certain things about Him are not true. He's not physical. He is not plural. Right? He is not limited, etc., etc. You've got to know certain things about Him. He communicates with the world. He is concerned with the world. He has expressed things that He wants us to do that He doesn't. He punishes. He rewards, etc., etc. He gives you, what's the minimum intellectual framework that a Jew needs in order to have a relationship with God? That's what he gives us in that. And very beautifully put, and of course sparked off an entire genre of literature all about that. You cannot imagine how many books, monographs, treatises, essays, doctoral theses have been written on Maimonides' works. It is beyond, if you do a search, seriously, if you do a search on the amount of books written about Maimonides, you will, just to read the bibliography, you'll probably spend a few years. It is unbelievable, right? The depth of his work. So that's what we call Siraj. The Ma'amar Kiddush Hashem and his letter to Yemen, these are two masterful letters in which he writes about, as I said, how Jews should deal with these terrible times, the Inquisitions, the Almohad persecutions, and so on and so forth. He wrote a Sefer HaMitzvot. You see, if you look through the Torah, how many commandments are there? 613. Anyone read through the Bible, it doesn't actually say commandment number 3. Commandment number 4. It doesn't do it. It gives you, there's a narrative, there's laws, thou shalt not. It's not so clear cut, right? So we have a tradition of the 630 commandments. Maimonides is one of the first to write an authoritative list of the commandments. Not the first, but one of the first to write an authoritative, what are the 613 commandments? What are they? So he wrote a book called Book of the Commandments, and he goes through all 613. He gives you a little précis of the commandment, the source of the commandment, basic parameters. Sometimes he gives you a reason behind it, and that's an amazing book. Again, sparked off tremendous whole genre of literature. Here's what we call his magnum opus. His greatest work, which was written, by the way, not in Arabic, but in Hebrew, is what's called Mishneh Torah, which means the repetition of the Torah. What he wrote was, and he writes in the introduction, and this is quite a statement, he got some flack for this, I must tell you. He wrote in the introduction, to be a good Jew, from now on, all you need are 2 books. You need the Torah itself, and you need Gateway to Jews, and you need, Freudian slip. And you need the Mishneh Torah. You need the Mishneh Torah. If you have the Mishneh Torah and you have the Chumash, you can be a good Jew. And you know what? I don't think he was exaggerating. Because you see, you want to know what to do. You look at the Mishneh Torah is the sum total of all of Jewish law. Everything. He's got laws in there about combat morality. At his time, there was no Jewish army. In his time, no one even thought that there would ever be a Jewish army. You believe in the Messianic times. Who knows? No one, Jewish army, and yet he's got laws of combat morality. He's got the laws of the Jewish monarch. He'd been exiled 3 times, from Spain to Morocco, from Morocco to Israel, Israel to Egypt. Right? He's living under the boot of a friendly dictator, but a dictator, the Sultan, the Saladin, and he's talking about the laws of Jewish monarchy. He's got the laws of the Jewish court system, the Sanhedrin, capital punishment. He's got the laws of business, torts, damages, etc. He's got contract law, he's got marriage law, he's got the laws of idolatry, he's got philosophy, laws of repentance. There is nothing that is not covered in Maimonides' writings. Nothing. Right? That's in the Mishnah Torah. That's in the laws. I mean, aside from the Mishnah Torah, he's got books about diet, correct diet. I have a close friend who's a physician, Dr. Tats, Akiva Tats. He's spoken here before. You may have heard him speak. Very famous speaker, Rabbi. Right? He's a physician as well. So internal medicine. He doesn't really practice anymore. Right? So, but he told me. He says he once brought to medical school in South Africa. He found a treatise by Maimonides about asthma. And he brought it to his one of his professors who was teaching about, he was a respiratory specialist, talking about asthma. The guy read it. He said to my friend, he says, this treatise is totally up to date with everything we know about asthma today. He says, unbelievable. He says, written in the 12th century, couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. Right? And a lot of his advice in terms of what he calls prophylactic medicine, that is to say, he says healthy diet, exercise, correct ways in which to eat, correct ways in which to drink, what you should drink, what you should eat, where you should live, etc. He says, if you follow this advice, you won't need a doctor. He says because any medical interference, whether it be through drugs or an operation, he says always has a downside. There's always a negative. There's always a side effect. It's just you say, you know what, I prefer to have mess up my stomach than have this terrible headache, so I'm going to take this. Or you might say, you know what, I prefer to have a headache and have decent digestion, so I'm going to take this. Or I prefer to, it's always a type. He says, however, he says the best medication, he says, is healthy diet, healthy living, healthy practices, psychology. He says in the Guide for the Perplexed, he writes, he says more than 50% of human suffering is self-inflicted. He says, you know what, it's a result of lifestyle choices, is what he writes. He says, because we pursue more than what we need. When we pursue more than what we need, we put ourselves under financial pressure that pushes us into illegal things. We put ourselves under social pressure that creates problems between myself and other people. It makes me jealous of other people. I'm always wanting to get ahead, etc. He said it creates social problems, psychological problems, medical problems. He says a stressful life also creates medical problems. He says, you think about it, he says, so many of our illnesses, so many of our diseases, so many of our psychological, social problems, legal problems, etc., you know what they come from? Lifestyle decisions. Not to be content, to always pursue more than what I need, and so on and so forth. It's an amazing thing to write. And you don't need to, you look at the newspaper, and you see the truth of what Maimonides says. Open up the newspaper any day, listen to the radio any day, you'll see the truth of Maimonides. Look at through history, it's amazing. He has amazing insights into many things. Anyway, so that's the Mishnah Torah. The next book I've got here is Moreh HaNevuchim, Dalat al-Ha'irim, which means a guide for the perplexed. By perplexed, who does he mean? So the Guide for the Perplexed is his great philosophical work. In his introduction he writes, this work, he says, he writes to a student of his, Yosef ibn Vaknin. He says, I'm writing this book for someone like you. Why? He says, you who have studied all of the Torah, the entire Talmud, all of the Midrash, all of the writings of our sages. You are, of course, fluent in a number of languages. You've studied science, philosophy, grammar, logic, music, etc. And now you have some questions. This book is for you. This book is not for someone who says, like, dude, is that an aleph? That's not who it's for. It's not like a beginner's guide to Judaism. Right? It is a book for people, because he said, you know what? You're not supposed to turn off your brain when you walk into the synagogue. He said God doesn't expect that of us. He wants us to think. He wants us to investigate. And so Guide for Perplexed has a whole section of proofs of God, proofs of his unity, proofs of his incorporeality, arguments, etc., etc. Fascinating. The third section gives reasons for all the commandments, not one of them resorting to anything metaphysical. In other words, you come to a total skeptic and you say, I've got 613 commandments for you. He said, whoa. You say, and I've got a reason for all of them without resorting to anything of faith or metaphysics. Amazing stuff. Right? Just to read through how he understands the commandments from a psychological, sociological, physical perspective. It's very, very, very interesting to see. That's his Guide for the Perplexed. And in it, of course, he has some controversial stuff as well. This is where he got into trouble. The scholars of Provence in France were very hardcore, hardline. And a lot of the scholars in Provence were very disturbed by things that Maimonides said. For example, everyone familiar with the story of Abraham and the three men? Three men come to Abraham and he feeds them, etc. Familiar with the story? Turns out they're three angels, and they promise him that he and Sarah will have a son, and they cure him, right, and they save Lot from Sodom, and they destroy Sodom, etc., etc. All that beautiful story, right? Maimonides says, had you and I been there, we wouldn't have seen a darn thing. All of this took place in a prophetic vision that Abraham was having. It's a little bit controversial. Right? Maimonides was very angry at him for saying this. He said, what do you mean? Are you telling me that Abraham did not give the food to the angels? No. Maimonides says, no, of course not. It was part of a prophetic vision. Maimonides will understand many things in the Torah as metaphor. He also, by the way, used to bring in, he says, it is a mitzvah, it's appropriate. He says, if science of our time understands the world in a particular way, and I'm able to explain the Torah in such a way that it conforms to the science that we understand, I should do that. Why create a conflict? Why should I have someone either reject science or reject the Torah? But you can't have both. Why? If I can explain it in such a way that it's in parallel, it works together with what we understand science, I should do that. I'm obligated to do that. He says he got in trouble for that as well. He also brought in a lot of Aristotelian philosophy, got in trouble. So the scholars in Provence, in France, a number of them made a ban against Maimonides some of his books. Not against everything, because he was so great no one could do that, but they banned certain of his books. The Guide for the Perplexed and the first section of his Mishnah Torah, they banned it. Now, there were some students of theirs that got so, as usual, got carried away, and you know what they did? They burned some of his books. One of these students, who was attributed to by the name of Rabbi Yonah, he had another student, and his other student writes that, interestingly enough, not long after they burnt, the Jews burnt some of Maimonides' books, the Christians in Paris burned 30 cartloads of Jewish books. And he says, ironically, he says, the place where they burnt the 30 cartloads of Jewish books was the same place where the copies of Guide for Perplexed were burnt previously. He says, and the ashes of one mingled with the ashes of the other. I don't know if that's literally true because it was 100 years later, right? But he says this is what we learnt. So they went overboard in the opposition. But of course, eventually Maimonides and all his works were widely accepted by all elements of Jewry, and of course those people who burnt it were one of them. There's a legend. It's not absolutely certain, but he wrote a great book all about repentance. Wrote a book about repentance, and they say. The legend has it that the reason he wrote a book about repentance was because of what he had caused by his opposition to Maimonides, that terrible tragedy of the burning of his books and everything that ensued from it. Right? He wrote a book all about repentance as a way of atoning for his sin. In addition, many letters, literally thousands of letters. Do we have thousands? Maybe I'm exaggerating. Hundreds of letters that we have. Could be he wrote thousands, but we only have extant hundreds of his letters on many different areas. I didn't give you the whole outline. I have 4 pages of outline going through all of his books and the subjects of his letters, and he's got some fascinating letters. You know, very often he always signs it the Katav Moshe, which means basically written by Moses. End of story. That's how he writes. Katav Moshe. And in his letters, you see sometimes he's very sensitive. He writes to people. He writes a whole idea, and he says at the end of it, he says, "I've just written what I believe, but you decide." You know. Now, obviously, his logic is so powerful. Some of his letters are rebukes. He's got a letter which is a heavy rebuke to a man who left his wife to go on a lengthy business trip for years, and he left her without support. And Maimonides found out where he was, and he writes a letter like, whew, right? I mean, he wrote another letter, one of the most famous letters. He's got 3 letters, most of them are in Arabic, 3 of them are in Hebrew. They were all to one person. They were written to a convert by the name of Ovadia. There was a convert, not the Ovadia we quoted last week, the music we had, a different convert. Ovadia was an Arab Muslim who converted to Judaism in Cairo. I think he was in Cairo, I'm not sure. But he wrote 3 questions to Maimonides. And of all the letters, Maimonides answers these 3 in Hebrew, not Arabic. Which is weird, isn't it? Anyone know why would he answer these in Hebrew, not Arabic? I mean, what?
Nobody would.
But all the letters he writes in Arabic. He's got very controversial letters in Arabic. And here, to one person who is a native Arab speaker, right? He writes in Hebrew. What's he doing? No, he writes controversial stuff in Arabic.
Maybe he wants to show respect for his conversion.
Exactly. Sensitivity. He's writing to him, I'm writing to you as a brother. You know, in other words, yes, he grew up as an Arab, he grew up as a Muslim. Now you're Jewish, I'm writing to you. He doesn't say this, but he's writing to him in Hebrew because he's showing, oh, you are totally, you're a brother now, I'm writing to you in Hebrew. You understand? It's a certain sensitivity which you see in his writing, which is very beautifully expressed here. So there's 3 letters, I'm not going to go through all 3, but just one of the letters is fascinating. In one letter, this convert says to his rabbi, says to Maimonides, he says, I had an argument with the rabbi of my synagogue. That's unusual, never happens, right? It's like probably the only time in history I've ever seen something like that. So he says to the rabbi, I had an argument with the rabbi of my synagogue, and he says, the argument was, is Islam idolatry or not? So I said, I grew up as a Muslim. I was a Muslim till the age 25 or so. He says, it's not idolatry. The rabbi got very angry with me and called me a fool and said, of course it's idolatry, you're a fool for saying it's not. So he writes to Maimonides, what's the correct view here? Maimonides writes to him. He says, first of all, he writes a beautiful blessing to him. And then he says, first of all, I want you to know, I've read the Quran and its commentaries. I've studied Islam and Islamic philosophers. And you are right, it is not idolatry. He says, number 1. He says, number 2, even if you were wrong and your rabbi was right, it would not be permitted for him to humiliate you in public and to call you a fool. He transgressed a serious prohibition of the Torah. He says, in addition, even if that would be true, he was right and you were wrong, and he humiliated. He says, but the truth is, the Torah tells us approximately 30 times, love the convert, bring the stranger close, don't oppress him. He's transgressed over 30 biblical prohibitions. He says, fourth, he called you a fool. How can he call you a fool? According to his view, you've come from idolatry to monotheism. He says, you are the most intelligent of people. He said, how can he call you a fool? According to him, you've come from idolatry to monotheism. That means you're very intelligent. He says, and fifth and finally, the Talmud says, one who loses his temper should be in your eyes as though he has worshipped idols. He says, so not only the Muslims not idolaters, but your rabbi is. Not one to mince words. This is what he writes. Not the type of thing the rabbi would have put up on his wall in his study. Look, I got a letter from Maimonides. He says, I'm an idolater. Right? But I mean, that's what he writes. He has another letter from Ovad, and he has another letter, just fascinating, about... he was not scared of giving the ruling when he needed to give a ruling. Right? The Jews, there was a false prophet, a false messiah. We've had many false messiahs throughout our history. Right? We've had, I mean, I'm sure everyone's heard of Shabtai Tzvi. He is the most infamous. But we've had about 30. And many of them had a lot of followers. Right? I'm reading a book now. It's called Mashichei HaSheker Umidnagdehem. False messiahs and their opponents. The book is about that thick. So literally fine print, about 1,000 pages, like just going through. It's horrifying. I'm reading another book about Shabtai Tzvi by Gershon Sholem. That's itself 1,000. I can only read it in bed because it hurts my wrist to hold it. So I have to balance it on my chest to read it. That's the only way I can read this. So anyway, so one of these false messiahs was in Yemen. And he was causing tremendous... Because these false messiahs, what would they do? They'd announce that they're king of the Jews. Now, the local Arab, Turkish, Christian ruler would say, what do you mean you're the king? I'm the king! Right? They didn't take kindly to this type of thing, right? It wasn't like, didn't have freedom of speech. Right? So you declared you're the king. So it created all types of problems for the Jews in Yemen. So Maimonides says, my advice to you is, get a doctor to declare him insane and have him locked up. He says, because there's no doubt in my mind that he probably is insane. He says, and even if he's not, he's a danger to the community, so you need to lock him up. He's going to cause death and destruction. He says, if you can't lock him up, kill him. Yeah, he rules that they should kill him. Here's a guy who's in... I mean, you understand what it was like in those days. It wasn't just to get bad press in the New York Times. Right? If a Jew rises a false messiah, people got slaughtered. People got tortured. Right? It was that. So he had the courage to say, this is what needs to be done. He had a fascinating, many fascinating... His letters just really reveal the person and really reveal so many ideas about him. That he was sensitive to people, but he was courageous. He was able to, very incisively, and despite the opposition... Anyway, He also wrote, I should point out, we have things that we don't have of his. We don't have his commentary on the Talmud. That doesn't exist. It's gone. I mentioned last week that we do have, it hasn't yet been published, we have notes that his students took during his Talmud classes in Cairo. That exists in Cambridge University today. It is being worked on as we speak. Right? Actually, maybe not. 7 hours ahead. Okay, not. But whatever. It's being worked on in England, and we have the notes. And finally, he wrote medical works. Quite a few. I mentioned the work on asthma. He's got works on health. He recommends, by the way, sport. He recommends not just exercise. He says exercise is boring. You've got to do something which is fun, so that you'll actually get into it. Right? I don't think he would have approved of treadmills. I mean, it's like, if that's all you're doing, that's great. But I mean, I think he was into he said, you need to, fun. He had a very interesting, his educational techniques and which are expressed in many of his commentaries. He was very into what's called balance. He felt a person should not go to extremes. He says, following the path of God is following a path of moderation. He says, you should not be a miser. You should not be a spendthrift either. You should try to find the middle path. He says, Jewish law is the mitzvot give us the ability to be balanced. He said, when you lead a balanced life, he says, you're not going to extremes in one area, you're better able to contemplate God and creation, to have a better relationship with others, with yourself, with God. He said, that's what it's about. He says, so you need that type of balance psychologically and physically in every area. He advocated that type of thing to follow that middle path, what he calls the path of balance. And then finally, just a couple of his communal work. He made many decrees, halachic decisions, letters of rebuke. He established the first public hospital in Cairo. I don't know if it was the first in the world, but it was one of. He established a public hospital to ensure that everyone could get medical attention. Very, very interesting, not just for Jews, but for everyone in Cairo. And he reversed the Cairo influence, and of course, as I mentioned, his works to this day are probably the most, amongst the most studied, other than Rashi, he's probably the most studied one of the scholars in the Jewish world. You go to any yeshiva, go to Lakewood, go to Philadelphia Yeshiva, go to Mir in Jerusalem, go to Sephardic yeshivas, go to Hasidic yeshivas, go to Lithuanian yeshivas, right? Everyone is studying they're studying Talmud, but Talmud, of course, predates Maimonides by 1,000. It's ancient, almost 2,000 years old. Maimonides was recent. It was only 800 years ago, right? But you know what? Everyone's studying Maimonides. Everyone's studying Maimonides, and we treat it with reverence. Every word was measured and weighed. Every word was, before he wrote it down, thought about many times, crossed out, rewrote, etc., etc. So anyway, it's a little bit of a glimpse, hopefully, into the life of Maimonides. A little bit about his life, a little bit about his writings, what he did. Next week, we're going to do back to audio-visual. I'm going to give you a ticket to Prague will cost you about $500 easily, right? Staying in the hotel, talking about $150 a night. Tour guide, the food, right? Easily, right? You'll be spending over $2,000 to go to Prague just for a few days. We're only going to charge you $500 for next week, right? That's right. No, it's included in the price. So we're going to give you a virtual tour of Prague next week on the thing, and hopefully then I want to talk about the Maharal, because we were supposed to talk about the Maharal today, but I got carried away with the Rambam rant, right? So, but the Rambam is worth it, right? So we'll talk about the Maharal, and we'll do the virtual tour of Prague next week, same bat time, same bat channel, and we'll see you then. Thank you very much for coming.